Hello, everyone. I'm Martha Tedeschi, the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of Art Museums and the Legacies of the Dutch Slave Trade, Curating Histories, Envisioning Futures. This four-part program is presented by the Center for Netherlandish Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the Harvard Art Museums, and Harvard University's Department of History of Art and Architecture. It's a wonderful collaboration, and we're glad that you can join us for this second session. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Harvard University, the Harvard Art Museums, and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston are situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people. We collectively recognize the long history of the land our institutions occupy today, and we strive to honor this relationship and to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and in our programming. The potential of art museums to use their spaces and collections to present more complete histories is at the heart of today's event. This program seeks to center the experiences of people of African origin and descent who were enslaved by the Dutch and other European powers in recognition of the relationship of these past injustices to ongoing racial violence and inequities. It has never been clearer that museums have an urgent responsibility to promote anti-racism, both within and on our walls. I'm personally very eager to listen and certainly to learn from today's speakers. I'm also very proud that this program was organized by 3 doctoral students in Harvard's Department of History of Art and Architecture, Sarah Mallory, Kayla Jackson, and Rachel Burke, together with a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Art Museums, Joanna Seidenstein. We are all grateful to the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, a university-wide effort housed at the Radcliffe Institute for supporting student research that informed this undertaking. And it's now my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Kayla Jackson. Kayla, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Martha, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Kayla Jackson, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's session, Decentering, Recentering, Forging New Museological and Historical Narratives. This session includes historians, art historians, and anthropologists whose work have challenged hegemonic narratives of history. I'm very excited to witness, along with you all, this amazing gathering of minds. For all that I know we've lost to the pandemic, this conference reoriented my perspective to become more attuned to the possibilities of a moment marked by such deprivation and distance. Working in the virtual sphere opened up opportunities for us to collaborate with scholars, artists, and activists across the globe in hopes of reaching a broader and more diverse audience. We've leaned into this moment to reconsider who our audience could be and how we could work to be more accessible in a time where access is by far our most important currency. As the title of this session alludes, this panel engages the possibility of looking to and thinking with history in a manner that privileges the marginal and the overlooked. How might our various and often disparate projects of world making be transformed by looking to that which rests in the margins, the silences, and the gaps? Today, I would like to think of this gathering as the beginnings of a sort of chorus, to borrow from Saidiya Hartman. It is a break in the melody, the bridge to elsewhere, and the refrain that keeps us pressing forward. It's our hope that this chorus fostered here in the shared, even virtual space will prepare us to conceive of alternate presents and futures by reconsidering all of these histories. So to begin, I'm just going to give you some logistical information. We're using the webinar format in Zoom. So you'll notice that the microphones are muted and your videos are off. But we do very much welcome your participation via the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. We'll dedicate roughly 15 minutes of the session for questions to all presenters. So throughout the presentations, feel free to present your questions in the Q&A box. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please do indicate that. And just a note, you will only see the questions that you present. And since we have such a large audience, it's possible that we won't be able to address every question, though we will try to do our best because we truly want to hear from you. And one final note, we will try to conclude just after 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Vincent Brown is the Charles Warren Professor of American History, Professor of African American and African Studies, and the founding director of the History Design Studio at Harvard University. His research, writing, teaching, and other creative endeavors are focused on the political dimensions of cultural practice in the African diaspora, with a particular emphasis on early modern Atlantic world. Brown is the author of numerous articles and reviews in scholarly journals. He's a principal investigator and curator for the animated thematic map, Slave Revolt in Jamaica, 1760 to 1761, a cartographic narrative. His first book, The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, was co-winner of the 2009 Merrill Curdy Award and received the 2009 James A. Raleigh Prize and the 2008 to 2009 Louis Gottschalk Prize. His most recent publication is Tacky's Revolt, the Story of the Atlantic Slave War, published by Belknap Press in January of 2020. And Sid, we'd love to hear from you now.
Well, thank you so much, Kayla. I very much appreciate that warm introduction. And I also want to thank Martha Tedeschi and Joanna Seidenstein, Erica Lawson, Rachel Burke, Sarah Mallory for hosting today and for organizing this fantastic event. And also my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today in conversation. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And of course, I want to thank all of you and the audience for joining us today. I'm going to break the rules a little bit right off the bat. And I think everybody else will be speaking much more specifically about Dutch slavery. So what I want to do is begin our session with a talk of broad scope, beginning from the recognition that visual culture transcended imperial and linguistic boundaries. I want to discuss a broadly shared sentiment associated with slavery, and that is the fear and dread that attends warfare. So I'll talk just about a single image, and not even a Dutch image at that, to make a simple point. We ought to think of slavery as a species of warfare and interpret its social relations and material artifacts accordingly. The former slave and British Royal Navy veteran, Olaudah Equiano, famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery was by nature a forceful assault to be met with simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of slaveholders. Equiano echoed the English philosopher John Locke, who argued in the late 17th century that the perfect condition of slavery was nothing but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Now, Locke extolled freedom as humankind's natural condition and consent as the basis of government, as we know, in theory. In practice, of course, Locke invested in slave trading and slaveholding enterprises and effectively defined war captives as a legitimate source of slaves who remain outside of potential political society. Equiano, by contrast, emphasized and highlighted the battle within slavery. Quoting John Milton's Paradise Lost, Equiano invoked Beelzebub's announcement of an eternal rebellion against God. No peace is given to us enslaved, but custody severe, and stripes and arbitrary punishment inflicted. What peace can we return? But to our power, hostility, and hate, untamed reluctance and revenge, though slow, yet ever plotting how the conqueror least may reap his conquest and may least rejoice in doing what we most in suffering feel. To the enslavers, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" And it was not a rhetorical question. Since the early years of slave society, slaveholders had often considered the enslaved as irreconcilable and yet intestine enemies, made subject to the colonists only by the rule of the whip. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772, when that island was still reeling from a series of slave uprisings during the previous decade. There he had seen how an entire world could be organized around violence and counterattack. He held this view in common with Black people in other times and places, where the enslaved often characterized their bondage as a permanent state of low-intensity war, talking regularly about how they might wage that war. Warfare migrates. This has never been more apparent than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles, employing European firearms, fed captives to the transatlantic trade in slaves. Masters and their human property struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to a borderless slave war, war to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, precipitating wars waged by the enslaved against slaveholders. In this sense, we can see slave insurrections as wars within wars, which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, they combined multiple conflicts at once. They were often extensions of wars on the African continent. They were race wars between Black slaves and white slaveholders. They were struggles among Black people over the terms of their communal belonging, for effective control of local territory and the establishment of their own political legacies. And they were eddies in the currents of imperial warfare among European powers that characterized the era of colonial expansion. The participation of slaves in such conflicts presented a grave challenge to the plantation system, which was the foundation of European empires in the Americas. Frightened to the core, slaveholders and imperial officials responded to the threat by enhancing the brutality of slavery and then taking measures that would engulf the Atlantic world in waves of genocidal violence. One historian has written that the 18th century apprehension of slave revolt oscillated between protracted stretches of near complacency and brief spasms of near paranoia. And yet, fear pervaded the slave societies of the Americas like a fog, hanging like a mist about every interracial interaction, swirling up at night when Black men, women, and children gathered beyond the surveillance of white people, crawling along the ground beside runaways who considered whether their only true escape from slavery might be the death of their masters. A gaseous dread blanketed every American colony where slaves were held in thrall. For whites, the feeling might dissipate in the light of day as they supervised rigid work routines and tallied signs of compliance, only to congeal again when confrontation threatened. Then barely suppressed anxieties could be swept up into storms of hysteria as violence cleared the haze. Of the bonds that connected the different slave societies across these empires, fear was the least tangible and most durable. Repression, fear's faithful adherent, was the most apparent link and also the most brittle. In some respects, the difference between the fear experienced by slaveholders and that experienced by the enslaved can be viewed as the difference between predictable and unpredictable terror. Slaves had always to fear the outbursts of slaveholders. The wrong look, word, or gesture from a slave might be enough to provoke a violent response. Acts of independence which could be interpreted as rebelliousness could provoke deadly reactions, and often did. So the enslaved lived with the certainty that terrible and terrifying things would happen. They were part of the routine. For slaveholders, it was the uncertainty of slave violence that made it so feared. Colonists strove for predictability in a capricious environment, a consistency that might allow them to imagine the profit of their efforts and propel them over the inevitable quirk of bad fortune. For this, they needed an almost mechanized obedience from their slaves. Yet while the enslaved might be cowed into submission, they could never be made into mere extensions of a master's will. And when they occasionally used their enduring capacity for unauthorized action against the interests of slaveholders, hurt them, or killed them, the response was shocked disbelief. It was the terror inspired by the sudden reminder that power does not guarantee security. One can see white fears visualized in engravings such as Soulèvement des Nègres à la Jamaïque in 1759, published in David François' Histoire d'Angleterre. Published in France in 1800, during the revolution in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, which had previously been home to the most profitable European colony in the world, the image encompassed the transatlantic geography of slavery and signified the deepest anxieties of the entire period between the mid-18th century and the end of the Haitian Revolution and beyond. In the depiction, Black insurgents have burst into a dining hall and are in the process of killing the men while the women flee. In the foreground, a muscular Black man lifts a cutlass high in the air, ready to deliver a killing blow to a white man whom he has by the collar. This man appears to be begging for mercy. Just behind and to the right of him, a rebel is in the act of thrusting a blade through the neck of another white man. To the left, obscured by a dining table, lies a dead man. We can only see his feet, but a Black killer looms over him too. The background is teeming with slaves brandishing swords and spears. The image almost certainly refers to the Jamaican slave uprisings of 1760 and 61, in which some 60 whites were killed. In 1774, in his History of Jamaica, Edward Long estimated that these insurrections were more formidable than any hitherto known in the West Indies. That the image gets the date wrong, there was no major disturbance in Jamaica in 1759, is irrelevant to its significance. Properly understood, this image refers not so much to a specific event as to a general fear of Black revolt. The image encapsulates racial panic as a genre of emotive representation. And in this way, it speaks to something broadly shared across European empires, wherever people were interested in the maintenance of slavery and whenever Black violence seemed to threaten white supremacy. The image spoke simultaneously to its immediate present and to its viewers' ancient fear of servile war. The Servile Wars were the name for three major slave uprisings that convulsed the late Roman Republic between 135 and 71 BC, the third led by Spartacus, the legendary gladiator and military leader. Narrated across generations and centuries, these classic revolts remained a looming warning to the masterclass that violence could always come from below. As a cautionary tale about the perils of slaveholding, they conveyed a visceral horror of inverted hierarchy, of violently contorted intimacy, of orderly spaces of peace and comfort turned into battlegrounds, and of brilliant and dependable soldiers turning their weapons against their commanders. In the 18th century, the specter of servile war was a reminder that within the lawful competition between nation states and empires, there was another war, simmering in every territory that Europeans depended upon for their fortunes, their power, and their sense of pride on the world stage. The threat posed by slave revolution represented not only a disturbance to property and order, but also the horrifying vision of a carefully calibrated and hard-won way of life collapsed in a heap behind the dinner table. Few things terrify the wealthy and powerful more than the prospect of defeat by the poor and weak, which would signify dishonor and a world turned upside down. Dominant peoples and nation states develop elaborate conventions for legitimating violence, maintaining their honor in victory and defeat, and recognizing violence as a regular feature, if unfortunate feature, of political struggle. But between the powerful and those they dominate by daily habit, there is no limit to the lengths they may go to maintain their supremacy. They will commit atrocities and massacres, to be sure, but they will disavow them too. They will refuse to admit that their combatants are legitimate enemies, and they will denigrate the past and present struggles of less powerful peoples. Slaveholders organized their societies to make themselves invulnerable. Their persons were to be beyond violation. Throughout the Americas, this required that white people be held in perpetual awe. The Jamaican planter historian Brian Edwards knew that terror was the fundamental rule in governing slave societies, acknowledging, in accordance with the French philosopher Montesquieu, that in countries where slavery is established, the leading principle on which the government is supported is fear, or a sense of that absolute coercive necessity, which, leaving no choice of action, supersedes all questions of right. And this might as well have been a writ and declaration of war without end. By custom, we treat war as an interruption in the normal course of human affairs. War is an anomaly in the regular order, a disturbance, a break, an aberration. War is also seen as a displacement of violence from one place to another, with formal military forces pursuing the conquest of territory. We commonly assume that lines of battle between warring states constitute the most important theaters of military engagement, and that peace treaties can mark a war's definitive end before another one begins with new causes and different fronts. By contrast, when war becomes a way of life, as in the abundant violence of slave war, there is no border and no final result. Slave war was pervasive and unending, the natural consequence of slavery itself. Servile wars did not arise from the peculiar properties of the people involved, but as products of the larger processes that had produced their antagonisms. The state of war that enabled Atlantic empires to flourish seemed to be limitless, yet it did follow a discernible course, winding its way through the arteries that connected Europe, Africa, and America. The violence of state-making, territorial acquisition, and strategic competition flowed into the quotidian brutality that typified the social relations of slavery, where the projection of will and the exercise of power were at their most naked and absolute. The artifacts of colonial empire were generated by these forces. We can certainly treat them as spoils of war, though I think it might be better to view them as war's poisoned fruit, to be consumed with great caution, or viewed as warnings against the continuation of slave war's essential features: rapacious exploitation, racial subjugation, and the proliferation of wars within wars, which have continued to the present day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Our next speaker is Pepijn Brandon. He's an assistant professor at the Free University in Amsterdam and a senior researcher, International Institute of Social History. He published widely on the economics of slavery in the Dutch Empire. In 2019 to 2020, he coordinated the Amsterdam city government's research into the role of its predecessors in slavery in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds, resulting in the volume Slavery in Asia and the Americas, the Amsterdam Report, which he co-edited. The Amsterdam city government is expected to offer firmer apologies for Amsterdam's role in slavery later this year on the basis of this report. You may go ahead, Pepijn.
Thank you, Kayla, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this wonderful panel and giving me the opportunity to speak with such a distinguished group of scholars. The opening of a major exhibition on slavery at the Rijksmuseum earlier this year marks a major moment, of course, in the representation of slavery in Dutch museums. But what happens in Dutch museums, of course, does not take place in a vacuum, but in an intense dialogue with major shifts that have been going on at least since 2013 in the way that slavery is being discussed in the Netherlands at large. That means that there is an intense dialogue between museums and what's happening within academic history writing, as well as with the fierce debates that rage in Dutch society over how to deal with the history of slavery and what that means for the present. This a new chapter to these fierce debates will in all likelihood be added when the Amsterdam city government this summer is expected to offer its formal apologies for the role of its predecessors in slavery at the National Monument for the Dutch involvement in slavery in Amsterdam, that you can see on this picture. I'm sorry. So my own involvement in this process was, as Kayla said, to coordinate the official research project of the city of Amsterdam into its own involvement in slavery. This was a joint research project in which over 40 scholars contributed on various aspects of this involvement in slavery. We made a number of choices that I think reflect the major shifts that have been going on in terms of the historical narrative as we tell it about the Dutch involvement in slavery. Perhaps the most significant of those was to discuss slavery not only in the Atlantic context but also in Asia. A second that I think deserves mention is to not focus solely on the 17th and 18th century, but to take seriously the longevity of the Dutch involvement in slavery that went on even longer than the British involvement or the French involvement, and stretched well into the second half of the 19th century. And a third important decision was to not only focus on the question that for perhaps a century has been absolutely central to Dutch historiographical debates on slavery, which is how much the Dutch earned or did not earn from slavery. Now, of course, the economics of slavery is an important topic, and it's a topic on which I have worked, on which much of my own work focuses. But in our volume, we very consciously made the decision to take a much wider lens and to address the role of slave resistance, questions of ideologies of slavery, the reflections of slavery in art and contemporary politics. Together, the 40 contributions led to the, in many ways, inevitable, and I would say for many of you in the audience, certainly not unpredictable conclusion that the involvement of Amsterdam mayors and magistrates in slavery was direct, global, large-scale, many-faceted, and long-lasting, and that this history continues to shape the city of Amsterdam in the present. Now, a question that many have asked and that I also ask myself is, how can such a familiar conclusion be perceived by wide sections of the audience as new? And there's the question is related in a way to similar questions for other aspects of the Dutch colonial past. The Dutch critical literature scholar Paul Bijl wrote an interesting article about colonial aphasia in the case of a gruesome picture that exists of a 1904 massacre of a village in Aceh in the course of Dutch conquest of what is now Indonesia, where he interestingly asks the question how it's possible that every new generation seems to rediscover this picture and once again be shocked by the horrors of the Dutch colonial past. Now, in the same way, we can ask this question about slavery, because of course, it's not the case that this history was unfamiliar to everyone in the Netherlands. I included this wonderful picture on the slide that is in the Rijksmuseum collection in Amsterdam of two Surinamese Dutch sailors from the Dutch Navy who attend the celebration of Emancipation Day in Amsterdam on the 1st of July 1948. So what is being rediscovered is not so much that the Netherlands was involved in slavery, of course, but what is being developed is a new way to view that history. And the reason why that is necessary, and that it's seemingly necessary to do so for every generation, the reasons are many. One of them is the persistent dominance of a very conservative historical narrative among historians, academic historians of slavery, that basically says, yes, we know that there was this involvement in slavery, but it was insignificant for the Dutch, an argument that has been primarily constructed on economic grounds. In other words, slavery was horrible, but the Dutch didn't get rich of it. Now, that's a debate in itself, but the sense that sort of slavery was there but was somehow marginal has been the dominant sort of view of slavery for a long time. A second aspect here is the problem with integrating narratives on slavery into the main themes of national historiography. And I say national historiography here, but the same could be said for city historiography for Amsterdam. You'll be aware that sort of one of the recent works on the history of Amsterdam was titled "The History of the Most Liberal City of the World." Of course, that has traditionally been the way that Amsterdam likes to view itself and to view its sort of long history as one of tolerance and liberalism in a sea of European freedom. And it's not hard to see why sort of the connection with slavery then creates huge problems. And the third aspect that makes this difficult to deal with the slavery past is, of course, the present day politics of race in a country that, at least until very recently, used to see itself, at least in its official narratives, as non-racist or post-racial. Now, in the remainder of this talk, I want to focus on how these three factors that I mentioned, how they influence choices when it comes to representing the history of slavery in a museum context. And the first thing we have to say is that although in the last few years we've seen a flourishing of new histories of slavery that actually challenge the older narratives that I just described, that, of course, as it never does not mean that these conservative narratives simply vanish or are replaced, but it means that the various narratives sit side by side, partly because there are real debates over interpretation, partly because there are misconceptions that are very sort of deeply sunk into public consciousness and that linger. And I want to give one example of this that was directly related to the context of sort of changing exhibitions, and that is a headline for an op-ed in one of the two largest newspapers in the Netherlands, the Volkskrant, in 2019, an op-ed by two of the leading older generations historians of the Dutch involvement in slavery, Piet Emmer and Henk den Heijer, where the headline ran, "Not everything in the Golden Age was connected to slavery." Now, of course, that's an argument that you can put. It's rather simplistic, but it's an argument. The problem, of course, was that not everything in the Golden Age was connected to slavery was a response to the decision of the Mauritshuis in The Hague to revisit the role of its founder, Johann Maurits van Nassau-Siegen, in the history of slavery. And what Emmer and den Heijer considered a forced attempt to drag slavery into the debate actually concentrated on the fact that Johann Maurits van Nassau-Siegen was the conqueror in the 1630s of Dutch Brazil, was himself a major slave owner, did himself actively participate in slave trade. So in other words, of course, it's not, you cannot put the argument that not everything in the Golden Age was connected to slavery, but to put the argument in connection to the conquest of Dutch Brazil, that is quite a stretch. Every sort of new decision of a museum to open an exhibition on slavery is accompanied by this kind of argument. And for a very long time, the difficulty for museums was the strong urge that was felt to placate both audiences, let's say. To say, as a museum, you cannot take a stand. There is an academic debate. Some say slavery is important, some say slavery is not. And then to try and find a sort of middle ground between these two positions. I think one of the very important developments of recent years that has characterized the recent wave of exhibitions on slavery, and certainly is characteristic for the Rijksmuseum exhibition, is a firm decision to take sides in that debate and to say, no, we acknowledge that slavery was important. And that is the way how we will present this story in our exhibition. But that brings us to a second question, that this means that the shift that there has been in academic history writing is sort of reflected in how museums talk about slavery, and also influences in turn the way that museums talk about slavery in turn influences agendas for academic historians like myself. But this whole sort of moving into new terrain also leaves us with many questions, and museums understandably struggle with how to deal with the open ends in these sort of debates, of which there are many. And many of those are concentrated around the complex question how to situate slavery within a wider systemic context of Dutch imperial expansion. And I just want to mention it. So to give one example of this is like the Amsterdam project that I was part of, the Rijksmuseum exhibition made the choice to deal with slavery both in the Asian and the American context. But the complex question that it always that then emerges is how we should sort of view those two slaveries in relation to each other, in comparison to each other, where there is strong pressure to either stick to an older narrative that basically says they were completely different, there were no similarities, and that tends to see slavery in the Indian Ocean world as one historian mentioned, called it cozy, but at least as mild, or sort of and mild and non-commercial, versus the harsh commercial and racialized slavery in the Americas. Now, recent historiography has shown that this is a far too simplistic picture, that both forms of colonial slavery were brutal, violent, and commercial, and racialized in many complex ways. But then the other tendency is to collapse the one into the other, and to basically treat slavery in the Asian Ocean area with all its complexities over this wide geography as more or less through the template, through the lens of Atlantic slavery. Now, these are large sort of debates how this then can be resolved in an exhibition context. But of course, once again, exhibitions do not take place in a vacuum. And in the Netherlands today, as in many other European countries, and as in, as I don't have to tell you, the United States, this also takes place in a context where the politics of race are part of fierce contention for the present. And some of the largest interpretive questions on the Dutch history of slavery revolve around the role of race, where it used to be completely sidelined. So the argument used to be that the Dutch involvement in slavery was rather pragmatic, economically focused, directed towards trade, and not so much involved in ideological debates and race making. Now, of course, that is one of the arguments we have been challenging in this newer historiography. And this is one of the text that I put on this slide is part of the introduction that we wrote to the book, where we argue that the pain that characterizes contemporary discussions on slavery cannot be separated from the fact that the abolition of slavery was accompanied by a calculated continuation of a policy of coercion, colonialism, racism, subjection, exclusion, and silencing, and in terms of exclusion and silencing, as well as the violence, a history that runs up to the present. But that brings us right into the middle of a debate that divides Dutch society. And I just very briefly want to give the result of two recent opinion polls. One opinion poll, both conducted by the Dutch newspaper Trouw. One opinion poll asked, how important do you think historical research into slavery is for the Netherlands? Where white Dutch responded 53% not important, 22% important, while Afro-Dutch people responded 64% important, 24% not important. That should be seen in connection to another recent poll that in various European countries asked how proud these populations were of their history in empire, where the Dutch scored, I would say, worse than any other, worse even than the British. 50% of the population, according to that poll, said they were proud of the colonial past, and 25% even said that the former colonies would be better off if they were still today a Dutch colony. Now, with that response among the wider audience, you can imagine that crafting these new narratives in the context of a museum is still perilous business, but it also involves a difficult task of designing a new language and a new iconography of slavery. And that is where I want to end here with this beautiful image that was designed for the book that we produced by the Dutch Surinamese Amsterdam artist Brian Elstock, reflecting on this, on how to think about the long continuities in this history of slavery. And it's with this image that I want to end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pepijn. Our next speaker is Elmer Colvin, assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. He teaches art history and he specializes in Dutch art of the 17th century. He's published on a wide variety of subjects, notably on images of Africans in Dutch art, which was also the subject of a recent exhibition he curated together with Stephanie Archangel and Epco Rumia in the Rembrandt House Museum in Amsterdam. Elmer is coordinator of the dual master program, Arts of the Netherlands, and editor-in-chief of Oud Holland, Journal for Art of the Low Countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to speak about the legacy of slavery in Dutch art and museums. The organizers have asked me to reflect on the exhibition Black in the Art of Rembrandt's Time, to share my personal experience to address typically Dutch racist blackface figures of Black Pete. So they've asked me to reflect on the exhibition Black in the Art of Rembrandt's Time, to share my personal experience in researching images of Blacks, and also to address the typically Dutch racist blackface figure of Black Pete. And I do apologize for this rather confronting image. So let me begin with a personal anecdote about Black Pete. In 2013, responding to a letter in the Dutch newspaper, that same Volkskrant that Pepijn just quoted, by an art historian who denied the connection between Black Pete and slavery, I published an essay in that same newspaper to disprove his statements. The essay provoked such responses on online platforms that the police found it necessary to provide a form of protection for a few weeks, of which I would notice nothing they said, and I didn't. The connection between Blackfeet and slavery clearly struck a white nerve, and it still does. Today, I will argue this is because of his history, which takes us to the heart of the Dutch 17th century. While it's easy from an academic point of view to dismiss the grim defense of Blackfeet as a backward response of a steadily decreasing group of traditionalists, I also hope to show that Blackfeet remains a challenge to both conventional and more recent historical and art historical narratives. Let me share another personal experience, the last one, to illustrate this. When Stephanie Archangel, Epco Unia, and myself made the exhibition Black in the Art of Rembrandt's Time, despite strong demands from some of our colleagues, we decided not to include Blackfeet for two reasons. The first, he is such a big issue that we feared inclusion would distract from the new findings and insights that we wanted to present. The impact of the presence of real Black people on Dutch art and the ways in which the emerging slave trade affected that process. Second, as I hope to demonstrate today, his history is too complicated to be reduced to one or two objects in an exhibition. We want it to be about something else anyway. So this is the exhibition. So let's look a little closer at Blackfeet and his history. In his pioneering study, Blacks in the Dutch World, published in 1993, Professor Alison Blakely calls him the best representation of all the composite images of Blacks which have come down through the centuries. A clownish and infantile assistant of St. Nicholas, Blackfeet is a gender-neutral, blackface, imaginary character dressed in a conspicuous costume. He helps the aged saint to distribute candy and gifts among children on his name day, which is 5 December. He has a dark skin, curly hair, bright red lips, and wide open eyes. He wears big earrings, a white collar, colorful livery with puffed slit sleeves, tights, trunk hoses, and a matching plume beret. His standard attribute is a sack with presents and candy. And these features were created around 1850 for an illustrated children's book called St. Nicholas and His Servant, written by the schoolmaster and author Jan Schenkman. It tells the story of St. Nicholas, who arrives with his servant in Amsterdam by boat from Spain, treats children rich and poor to candy and gifts, admonishes them to be good, and then leaves by hot air balloon. The figure of Blackfeet is most likely an invention of Schenkman based on older traditions. It's unknown who designed the color lithographs and who invented Blackfeet's appearance. Although usually referred to as a sailor, in the first edition, he was clearly dressed in an Oriental fashion à la Turque, with long white puffed pants, a short open jacket with red decorations and red slippers. Probably the illustrator reasoned that the servant of a Turkish saint should wear an Oriental costume. However, since such Orientalism was not yet in vogue in the Netherlands, Blackfeet's initial appearance must have been too unfamiliar to appeal to children, and someone decided he needed a rigorous makeover. In the second edition made him younger and shows the colorful costume that stuck ever since. Whoever designed this new Blackfeet obviously found inspiration in the young and black page boys that were ubiquitous in early modern Dutch art, and that must have been much more familiar than the figure dressed à la Turque. We encounter him in prints by Rembrandt, paintings by Jan Steen, and even in a militia portrait by Bartholomeus van der Helst. Also, he was a stock figure in Italianate harbor scenes, of which this large phalanx for Prince-elect Johann Wilhelm von der Pals is an exceptional high point, with a black boy probably portrayed from life. In his most characteristic way, he occurs in high life genre paintings, still life and portraits from the 1670s to 1730s. For example, in paintings by Eglon van der Neer, Juriaan van Streek, and Caspar Netscher. There can be no doubt that the inventor of Black Pete, who probably lived and worked in Amsterdam, was familiar with images like these. This one, for example, could simply be seen on the street. And these were in Amsterdam's publicly accessible town hall. The painting by Lievens, the servant, as so often, even holds a white horse, much like Black Pete. Finally, the Black Page abounds in prints and popular book illustrations. Also quite typical, an early quite typical appearance of a page in 17th century art is Anthony van Dijk's portrait of Henrietta of Lotharingen, Princess of Phalsbourg, painted in Brussels in 1634. He has such individual features that he's probably modeled after life, but it's unknown who he is or whether Henrietta actually had a black page. Van Dyck may have taken his cue from Titian's portrait from around 1525 of Laura di Dianti at the court of Alfonso d'Este in Ferrara. It's the earliest, and that's this one. It's the earliest portrait with a black page known to date. Real black servants arrived in the northern Netherlands in the early 17th century with their Portuguese masters from Antwerp. For the Portuguese elite, owning black slaves was a sign of social prestige and status. In this, they followed the court of João and Catarina of Habsburg in Lisbon, for whom blacks were a symbol of their global power, as this portrait of from 1553 of their daughter-in-law Joanna of Austria with a black page makes abundantly clear. Archival documents do not give a name, but they do reveal the page is a girl. Portuguese merchants and representatives took black domestic servants with them to Flanders. Catarina, who served the Portuguese merchant João Brandão in Antwerp, where Dürer drew her in 1521, is a well-known example. Less familiar are Ambrosius Benson's merry companies with black pages. They were tremendously popular in Bruges between 1540 and 1550, when that city housed a large Portuguese community of wealthy merchants who would later move to Antwerp and eventually settle in Amsterdam. Although we now call these black servants pages, in the strict sense, they were not. Traditionally, a page was a young male noble who served for a period at court. The black figures we see in paintings will have been footmen, common children who were selected for their beauty and intelligence and dressed in livery, as much for show as for use. The black footmen were enslaved children, likewise selected for their beauty and wit, but sold or presented to the different courts in Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. His conventional age, his conventional young age, the subservient role, his bringing of gifts, and his exotic appearance made the black servant the ideal figure for the character Schenkman had in mind. Although the black page seems to have originated in Iberian and Mediterranean courts and was brought to the north via the Spanish Netherlands, a 19th century audience will have considered him unambiguously as a servant to wealthy Dutch merchants, but with an exotic Mediterranean ring. The striped dress, the turban, and the earrings would still be associated with Mediterranean Moors, and therefore, in the logic of a fairy tale for children, fitting for a servant of a Turkish saint who had arrived in the Netherlands from Spain. Throughout the 19th century, the 17th century was perceived as a glorious time in which the Dutch burghers withstood invasion by foreign monarchs, sailed the seas, ruled the world, and created their liberal burgher merchant paradise, a veritable golden age. The period became a touchstone that inspired both early 19th century ideals of enlightened burgher society and a new wave of colonialism in the second half of the 19th century. Although under the pressure of the movement towards a more global and inclusive society, historians and art historians recently started to question traditional narratives, including that of the Golden Age, many in the Netherlands and some abroad still see the 17th century as a true and glorious start of present-day Dutch society. Pepijn already referred to this. In that sense, many Dutch experience a critical analysis of Black Pete and his 17th century origin as an attack on the foundational epoch of the Netherlands that they almost naturally identify themselves with. And the question is, what to do with Black Pete and his history in this new and complicated context? Although we have been studying images of Africans in Dutch art for some time now, and have seen a number of important publications and exhibitions, the Black servant still poses a social and therefore also a museological challenge. To make matters even more complicated, a big paradox surrounds Black Pete's ancestor. He's entirely inconspicuous, but he is also the most ubiquitous Black person in Dutch art. That makes him difficult to understand from a historical perspective. What is his history? Why does he occur so often in profane images? And why is he both a minor and obligatory motive in history paintings representing the Mediterranean world? While his relevance to our society is now abundantly clear, understanding the importance for the historical 17th century audience is actually quite challenging because we have no or only a very fragmented narrative. Thanks to the historian Mark Ponte, there are bits and pieces of information about free Blacks that we could integrate in Black in Rembrandt's time. Esther Schroeder has uncovered the history of two Black pages, Cupido and Cideron, at the Dutch court around 1800 in an exhibition in 2017. The Mauritshuis is re-examining its Brazilian history through exhibitions and research projects. Black heritage tours and books present narratives of colonial history and slavery in Dutch 17th century city centers. Also, there are many excellent websites about Africans in Dutch and European art and history on the internet. But what's still lacking is a proper narrative of the inconspicuous Black servant in Dutch art. And to me, this is one of the biggest challenges. The Black servant was clearly relevant to the historical audience, and he has a huge legacy with an enormous impact on present-day Dutch society. But our understanding of his history is still highly fragmented. I know only of two cases where the archives have been generous enough to allow for a reconstruction of the outlines of a life, that of Christiaan van Afrika and Thabo Jans, who later changed his name to Adriaan de Bruin, Adrian the Brown, Mr. Brown, when he became a free and prosperous man. Both were well educated and loved. They were able to make a career for themselves, married Dutch wives after the death of their master. But who is on Frans Hals's family portrait? Who is on the Duister? Who is on the Jan Miense Molenaar, the portrait of the Van Loon family? And who is the footman, Jan Dam de Moor, documented at the court of Orange around 1665? Is it this boy who was portrayed in Jan Meijtens' portrait of Maria of Orange in the 1660s? It's the logo of today's meeting. Who is the boy on Pieter Nasson's portrait of Johan Maurits that we just saw in Pepijn's presentation? So far, it's gone unnoticed that he strongly resembles the boy on the portrait of Maria of Orange. Probably it's the same model. But note how his features and color change in the different copies that have survived, as, by the way, do those of Johan Maurits himself. Recent research tends to focus on Amsterdam, but we should not forget The Hague. The court and the presence of an international elite make it a likely place for Black servants and footmen. Indeed, a surprisingly large number of portraits in The Hague, portrait painters in The Hague added Black figures from the 1640s on. Some of the figures in the corners of the paintings or in their backgrounds by Jan Meijtens, Adriaan Hanneman is this one, Jan de Baan, Pieter Nasson, Pieter Verelst, Martinus Lengele, Caspar Netscher, and his son Theodorus Netscher will have been real models. And what can we find in the municipal, family, and royal archives about Black servants and footmen that have not been portrayed? If we want to change or enrich our narratives, the Black servant seems a good but challenging place to begin. I hope to have demonstrated how layered this deceptively simple pictorial motif is. There are art historical questions about the production and functions of these paintings, historical questions about the identity and the lives of the persons in them, and social historical and sociological questions about the afterlife and the reception of these paintings. Each set of questions creates its own narrative, and together they are related in many complicated ways. This requires close collaboration between historians, art historians, and sociologists. And in retrospect, I realize we had all three on board in the creation of Black in the Art of Rembrandt's time, and I'm now convinced that this has contributed to its success. It seems a promising model for future research projects as well. Thanks. Let's see if I can stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Elmer. Our next speaker will be Claudia Swan. She is the Mark Weil Professor of Early Modern Art History in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis, and a scholar of early modern Northern European visual culture with a concentration in the Dutch world. She's published extensively on early modern art, science, and collecting, and on Dutch visual culture. Recent publications include a study of Dutch taste as a market sensibility and her monograph, Rarities of These Lands, Art, Trade, and Diplomacy in the Dutch Republic, was recently published with Princeton University Press. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Kayla, and thank you all for being here. I'm incredibly honored to participate in this event. I'm very grateful to all of the organizers and to all of the institutions who have supported the organizers in their efforts. Truly, this is an exceptional painting. The depiction of two Black-skinned men together and alone, joined in a gesture of familiarity at least, and affection or brotherhood at best, painted by the foremost Dutch painter of humans as individuals, Rembrandt van Rijn, and painted in the last decade of the artist's life, a period recognized as having been both personally and stylistically inward-looking. Although this painting was not shown in last year's stunning exhibition, Black in Rembrandt's Time, it did motivate and structure that exhibition and the book published to accompany it. We heard from Stephanie Archangel last week about her formative encounter with the painting. The book, Black in Rembrandt's Time, opens with a description of the painting, calling it, quote, one of the most famous portraits of Black people, and notes that, quote, Rembrandt's painting raises the question of what image of Black people was conveyed by 17th century art in the Netherlands. Did it change as the century went on? And if so, why? What sorts of Black people were in fact present in Holland, and did they appear in works of art? Close quote. Now, these are complex questions, to say the least. Their complexity reflects the sticky relationship between biography and art history, between Black lives and pictorial strategies for the depiction of Blackness, between Blackness and representation. In addition to presenting an extraordinary array of works of art in the exhibition and the publication, both also make new archival findings known about the lives of Black individuals in Rembrandt's Holland. Archivist Mark Ponte builds on what he calls fragments of human lives to document Black lives of the time. The Brazilian employee of the West India Company, Peter Klaas Brown, Mr. Brown, whom Elmer Colvin just referred to, who married Lijsbeth Pieters of Angola in 1649, and who later, a decade later, witnessed the baptisms of Black children. He or they are just some of the several members of what Ponte describes as a small Black community in and around the Jodebreestraat in Amsterdam, the street where Rembrandt lived until 1656. As the art historian Esther Chadwick has noted, quote, "Seeing the names of these Amsterdammers in the city archives is like looking at light emitted from distant stars, the indexical thrill of lives long past flashing before your eyes in the here and now," close quote. The nameless Black figures captured in works by Rembrandt and his contemporaries, could they be these very men, women, children? Might archival records and other sources enable us fully to acknowledge, recognize, and identify the many Black figures that populate the visual field? The work of Esther Schroeder, Dienke Hondius, and Mark Ponte to recuperate the history of Black lives in the Netherlands from archival oblivion and the erasures of history holds out the promise of matching names to faces. And yet, a few exceptions notwithstanding, it often seems that art historically and museologically speaking, the best we can do to identify these figures is by their makers, their media, or by type, the exoticizing Trony, the courtesan, African men, a magus. And I'm referring here to the titles that are given to these works. In general, Black figures remain invisible as individuals. Consider this Black boy attending to Mary Stuart, to whose exotic splendor he is an accessory. We know more about the extravagant Tupinamba featherwork cape she wears and where she wore it, as an Amazon in a court masque she performed in 1655, than about him, whose beauty is a foil to hers. He serves her physically in adorning her and pictorially as an attribute of her extravagance. Mary Stuart's boy has long been overlooked, just like many others, including the barefoot Black males who attend to this Dutch East India Company, VOC, merchant. This painting was completed in the year that its primary subject and patron died, and it serves as a retrospective portrait of his colonial might. Bollebrand Grijns de Jonge, this man was active in the East Indies, in India, and in Persia before he returned to the Netherlands to his hometown of Alkmaar in 1648. The large painting, which still hangs in Bollebrand's hometown of Alkmaar, featured prominently in the 2015 exhibition Asia in Amsterdam. And in the Amsterdam iteration of that show, it was hung just inside the entrance, so just beyond the doorway you see here. Bollebrand, the picture is roughly life-size, seemed to represent the world on exhibit. Imagine then how odd it seemed that the wall label identified him alone, omitting any mention of the two Black men, in spite of their outnumbering the subject of the portrait, deafening silence, as if they were invisible. Wayne Modeste has written about the Black boy depicted in the portrait of Mary Stuart, which he first saw in 2015, coincidentally the same year as the Asia and Amsterdam exhibition. In the exhibition space in which it was displayed then, no mention was made of the boy. Modeste writes, quote, "The dehumanizing force of colonialism reduced this Black young man to property, representing him as an accessory. The effect of the painting's description was a double erasure that excised the Black subject altogether." The pictorial convention of depicting powerful white sitters in the company of Black figures was not exclusive to Dutch painting, but Dutch examples abound, iterating over and again Black figures as both crucial and invisible, like the Zwarte Piet, as Elmer Colvin has just described him. Consider Frans van Mieris the Elder's Berlin painting, Junge Dame vor dem Spiegel, or in English, Young Woman Before a Mirror, or Young Woman with a Pearl Necklace. These are the titles given to it. Now, this is a dark interior, to be sure, but it seems perfectly clear to me that there is a Black woman at this woman's side. Van Mieris's painting stands for the others I have just shown in performing what the brilliant scholar Kim Hall quite long ago identified as, quote, the use of Blackness in art to render whiteness visible and overpowering, close quote. In a world of luxury objects, this Black woman is but a foil to her lady's whiteness, crucial and invisible. Or recall Maria of Orange's groom, the poster boy for today's session, relegated to the bosky, darker half of the painting and to the care of the animal. To reframe the question that I opened with, how can we square records of lives lived with the pictures and pictorial conventions of Dutch art of the early modern era, during which the Dutch actively engaged in transatlantic slavery and enslavement in the Indian Ocean world? In spite of the individual lives we may be able to access by way of archival and other documents, the horrifying reality of the slavery that enabled Dutch might means countless faces and bodies and souls whose names are lost and whose labor framed the taste for luxury artworks in the Dutch fatherland. Recently, in writing about highly valued, shiny luxury commodities in the Dutch world, I have explored the invisibility of labor, and Black labor in particular, focusing on the work of Georg Eberhard Rumphius, who lived out his life in the service of the VOC in the East Indies. I have tried to reframe the labor on which the production of exotic collectible rarities depended. And to be clear, that labor is the labor of Black bodies. Today, I want to propose a related inroad into the issue of labor that relates to the place of slavery in Dutch 17th century aesthetics. My subject here is ebony, the exotic Black wood that formed a key ingredient in the making of Dutch 17th century taste, and a substance integrally linked to slave labor. Quickly though, in response to questions raised last week, I want to acknowledge the role that contemporary works of art can play in our considerations. Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum, an installation mounted 30 years ago at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore, speaks, I think, very clearly to how museums can account for the place of slavery in their collections and in their very purpose. Here, by showcasing the metalwork of slavery and the work of American silversmiths in a profound face-off that counters the reality of one form of captivating metalwork, that is the shackles, with its sublimation in silver. Or consider this canvas painted by the American artist Titus Kaffar to mimic a Frans Hals family portrait, which we've just seen, and whitewashed by the artist to address the occlusion of figures who look like him in the art historical record. So this is a painting painted in emulation of the Frans Hals family portrait, to size roughly, and during a TED talk, the artist Titus Kaffar painted over the white figures. Kaffar's shifting the gaze is a call to which Black in Rembrandt's time has certainly responded. But how long must it take before museums catch up in their efforts to render Blackness visible? The only reference to anything Black in the description of Frans Hals' painting on the Museum Thyssen-Bornemisza website is to the painting of the eyes. The Black boy does not even figure in the website text. By contrast to Hals, the New York-based contemporary artist William Villalongo makes Blackness visible in some of the most inspiring work I have seen recently. Extraordinary collages, which I show you here with permission of the artist. I'm very pleased to show them to you here. Collages that bring together, quote, geologic forms, meteorites, butterflies, drinking gourds, and African sculpture interspersed with leafy cutouts. And I'm quoting here from the artist's statement. The artist, quote, creates a portrait from ecological and cultural histories, emphasizing diaspora, deep time, freedom, beauty, and transformation. By collapsing time and space through earthly and cosmic imagery, the artist calls attention to the fluctuating role of the Black figure. Villolongo's recent work immediately put me in mind of the celebrated inlay tableau by the 17th century Amsterdam goldsmith and artist Dirk van Rijswijk. The singular difference between Villolongo and Rijswijk being that whereas the former makes explicit reference in his titles and his explications of his practice to the Black experience, to slavery, and to Black heritage, the most famous text about Van Rijswijk's work, penned by the poet Joost van den Vondel, sublimates the whole colonial project and makes the Dutch master a master of the world market. And I should note that this text was written about, not about this work. This work was in the collection or in the possession of Nicholas Witsen, the most powerful VOC administrator of his time. Vondel's verse was written in admiration of this tabletop, now in the Rijksmuseum. Both of these works, the tableau I just showed you and this tabletop, use ebony in differing degrees. Ebony as surface in the case of the tableau and others by Van Rijswijk, and here ebony as frame. The surface into which the inlay has been placed is actually toothstain, slate. Ebony is a naturally dark hardwood native to both Africa and the Indies. Diospyros crassiflora hirn, commonly known as Gabon ebony, African ebony, West African ebony, or Benin ebony is endemic to Western Africa. And then there's also Ceylon ebony. The African ebony has been used, or at least is written about, since there are records of it since ancient Egyptian times. Both forms of ebony are very hard, very fine pores, and polished to a high luster. They are both nearly extinct. Ebony was widely used in Dutch 17th century ateliers to make picture frames, mirror frames, chests, cabinets, and tableaus, as I just showed you, and it appears especially prominently after 1637, the year in which the Dutch East India Company fortified the tiny island Mauritius to protect access to the old growth there. And just to illustrate the ubiquity of ebony frames, now I should say frames were also gilded. That's a different subject though. But the ubiquity of ebony frames, I show you this Metsu painting where we have both a mirror in an ebony frame and a painting behind a curtain in an ebony frame. Rembrandt's work is regularly associated with ebony. Documents dating to the later 1630s, the 1640s, and into the 1650s attest to Rembrandt paintings, and even a print, which I take to be this, having been framed in ebony. The inventory drawn up of his home in 1656 records one mirror in an ebony frame and one ebony frame. In a letter to Constantijn Huygens in The Hague, Rembrandt noted that he had sent two paintings to the stadtholder, Frederik Hendrik, in ebony frames. In 1653, the same Huygens wrote of ebony frames that they themselves could add luster and cost to a lesser work of art. Quote, an ebony frame can enrich a poor canvas and make it look or sell as well as a good one. In an exceptionally well-preserved portrait signed and dated 1640, that is in an ebony frame, by the way, but that cannot be reproduced for some reason, Rembrandt himself recorded the likeness of the most celebrated ebony worker of his time, a man, Reinier Baarsen, the extraordinary historian of furniture and decorative arts. Reinier Baarsen has called Domer, quote, the only Dutch 17th century furniture maker who has long enjoyed a substantial reputation, close quote. Quite a lot is known about Herman Domer and his craft, truly unique for the time and the wellspring of later French styles. As early as 1618, when he married in Amsterdam, Domer is described as an Ebenhoutwerker, an ebony worker. By 1626 in Amsterdam, a form of guild protection for ebony workers, again called Ebbenhoutwerkers, was established. Domer died in 1650, and it is generally agreed that this majestic kas, or chest, with its impressive Solomonic columns, auricular carvings, and mother-of-pearl inlay of tulips, the value of which was extremely high at the time the chest was made, that this was Domer's finest work. It is in any case unique for its size and its technique. There we go. And I show you here a photograph of the inside, which does include other forms of wood other than the ebony veneer, by the way, which is what is used here as ebony veneer on oak. In the inventory of his widow's possessions drawn up after her death in 1678, among the items listed last are een grote ebbekast met parelmoer ingelegd, so a very large ebony chest inlaid with mother of pearl, valued at the astonishing rate of 945 guilders, which is about 11,000 euros in today's money. And the next item in the inventory, one piece of ebony wood from Mauritius at 6 guilders. Now, where is what was Mauritius? Known to Arab traders and to the Portuguese, the tiny uninhabited island in the Mascarenes, here, east of Madagascar, which is here, was claimed by the Dutch in 1598 when a fleet arrived by accident at what they named after their stadtholder, Maurits of Nassau. In his history of the Dutch East India Company, written at the close of the 17th century, Peter van Dam writes that, quote, the thoughts and inclinations of the company were directed there from the year 1604 to take possession of that island and populate it, also with animals, fruit trees, etc. It was, he explains, long reputed to be a very healthy and fruitful island. It promised health and wealth. In 1609, the directors of the VOC discussed settling on the island with 2 natural harbors and rich in edible fauna and fish. For many years, it served as a refreshing station before the final leg of the voyage east. The first Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, Peter Bolt, after whom this rock formation is named, died in a shipwreck off the coast of Mauritius in 1615. And incidentally, Bolt sent pieces of ebony back to his children in Holland as toys in 1611. So while the island was a natural place to rest and refresh, it was also always known to be a source of the valuable dark wood. And I show you here on the right, the earliest image of the southeast harbor, the main harbor of the island of Mauritius, which was made in 1601 by a subsequent journey, and would point you in the general direction of the wonderful work by Sarah Mallory, just published, Memory, Spaces, and Faraway Places on Mauritius, Golden Age Myths, and the Origins of Dutch Landscape. Now, it was a place famous for its giant tortoises. We see here in an account of one of the early expeditions, Dutchmen riding one of the tortoises, the island's tortoises. It was also where dodos were observed and then quickly went extinct. A sort of utopia, we might say, problematic. One account dated 1616 reports the shipment from Mauritius of over 46,000 pieces of ebony and states that there were at that time 36 Ebbenhoutwerkers on the island. It's the same word used 2 years later to describe Domer when he married, though I am quite certain the work designated was different on Mauritius. In 1621, the Dutch agent Theodor Rodenburg beseeched King Christian of Denmark to embark on a venture that would outfit a fleet to sail to Mauritius in the hope of acquiring gold. Rodenburg also noted in his proposal that the island was very abundant in other growth, where daar zij hun voordeel en profijt mede menen te doen, where they wanted to make advantage and profit. Advantage and profit derived principally in the dense ebony forest. Amber was also easy to find on the beaches. Nothing came of that venture, but of the profit Rodenburg promised, the Dutch did certainly partake. In 1638, spurred by competition from France and England for access to the island and its resources, the VOC established Fort Frederik Hendrik, named after Maurits's successor, a stadtholder of the nascent Dutch Republic, and they settled in, occupying the island continuously until 1658. In 1652, the Cape of Good Hope had been secured by the Dutch, and the need for a refreshment station farther east decreased. You see what I did here with the moving tortoises, right? The Dutch occupied Mauritius again from 1664 until 1710, after which it was claimed by the French. The Dutch attempted to cultivate orange trees, cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, and vineyards, and sugar, and even brought a sugar mill to Mauritius, to no avail. It was rough going, life on Mauritius, but for no one more than the enslaved Malagasys who were brought by the hundreds from Madagascar in the 1640s to harvest ebony. And this is a later image of a different part, not near the main harbor, a different part of the island that was sent to the Cape, but it shows you a worker, he's chopping up what seems to be a vignette of a future print. I'm not quite sure what's going on here, but it also shows you the ebony wood on the forest floor. Peter van Dam, the company historian, reports that a sawmill was introduced to saw planks of the black ebony, which is very abundantly available there, close quote. And I suspect that this is the sawmill, as this is an image of the river on the west side of the island. Adriaan van der Stel, governor of the island in the 1640s, was under orders from the VOC to harvest as much ebony and procure as much amber as possible. During his tenure there, 6,000 pieces of ebony were shipped to Batavia annually, from whence they were exported to the fatherland. Now let me be perfectly clear. That wood was harvested and prepared by enslaved laborers brought to the island, an uninhabited island, by the Dutch throughout their governorship of the place. And there is no time for me to really get into this, but I also want to clarify that it was in 1637, so a year before the Dutch set up their fort on Mauritius, that the Dutch under that was Johan Maurits captured the Portuguese fort Elmina on the west coast of Africa in order to supply enslaved persons to the Dutch colonies in Brazil. The late 1630s were banner years for Dutch access to colonial goods and slave labor. And I show you here the Dutch names, well, first the current names of the various states of West Africa, and also the Dutch names at the time. So the Peperkust, the Ivoorkust, and the Goudkust. And it's in the Goudkust that Elmina is located. The period during which the Dutch enslaved inhabitants of Madagascar to harvest ebony coincides with the period during which ebony work rose to prominence back in the fatherland. Prized for its smoothness, its blackness, its exoticism, ebony was worked and oiled to a high sheen in the form of frames and cabinets, in particular also chairs, as you see here, but cabinets, the latter a most colonialist form of container, and both frames and cabinets, crucial elements of Dutch taste at the time. So my closing thoughts. In his late 17th century account of Mauritian ebony, the naturalist Rumphius bemoans the over-harvesting by greedy Dutchmen, ons eigen volk. I couldn't help but recall the Rembrandt painting with which I began today, when Rumphius writes, quote, Mauritian trees also have the quality that the bark is a bit grayer than those of Buro, with many black spots, and when the tree is old and ready to be harvested, it has the circumference of 2 men round, close quote. A form of blackness highly prized in Rembrandt's time and the product of exploitative labor, ebony has also served as a metaphor for the slavery involved in procuring it for luxury use. In 19th century Dutch literary sources, slaves are referred to as levend ebbenhout, living ebony. I have tried to clarify here, ebony, as I've tried to clarify here, exemplifies a colonialist aesthetics advanced by the Dutch in the 17th century and may be understood as a sublimation of slavery. But let us work to stem the tide of namelessness and facelessness by acknowledging it and its power. And to conclude, I leave you with this thought or this observation. An extraordinary passage from The Extraordinary Souls of White Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. And when I first started to think about ebony, and particularly these ebony chests, this description, which is of slavery, the heaven-defying audacity, is what came to mind as perhaps an appropriate way of thinking about the aesthetics involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Our final speaker is Suzanne Blier, the Allen Whitehill Klaus Professor of Fine Arts and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, as well as a member of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. Her most recent book projects include the forthcoming 1325, How Medieval Africa Made the Modern World, and her 2019 book, Picasso's Demoiselles, The True Origins of a Modern Art Masterpiece, which won the 2020 Robert Motherwell Award for an outstanding publication in the history and criticism of modernism in the arts by the Dedalus Foundation. In 2011, 2 of her articles were selected for the Centennial Anthropology of the Art Bulletin, comprising the 33 top articles over the journal's 100-year history. She was one of only 3 art historians, along with Meyer Shapiro and Lee Steinberg, to have 2 articles included. Let me go now, Suzanne.
There we go. Thank you so much, Kayla, Sarah, the organizers and fellow panelists. I'm going to jump from Claudia's wonderful presentation and others directly into the continent and speak about the issues of invisibility, reframing, and the excising of the Black subject from the vantage point of Africa itself, and the works of art which we find there. I would simply begin by noting what everyone here already knows, that the Dutch East India Company was the wealthiest corporation of all times. And we have addressed this from a wide variety of vantages, slavery certainly, but also products. And I think it's in this way that the African piece is particularly important. We well know the brilliant Dutch map makers and how they have engaged with the continent in critical ways. And we also know how they put in place within Africa itself various new maneuvers for addressing the manufacturing and the re-engagement of goods within the continent. But what we don't know all that well is the centrality of Africa and its arts within this larger context. The goods that went to Africa itself and how African works of art help us to understand the importance of the continent in a new way. You don't get from Dutch West Indies to Dutch East Indies without touching down at key sites within Africa itself, particularly after the founding of Cape Town, where all ships had to land in part because they had to refurbish and provide enough sustenance for the remaining of that journey. My talk is going to be focused on 3 principal sites, Benin, Dahomey, and Asante, but in leading up to that, just to note this important part of the history. And the Dutch in Cape Town, with the introduction of slave labor from Asia, 80% of which was Indian, to really man these plantations to provide the cattle and the crops that were essential for it. And it's hard to understand the later history of South Africa, the contestation between the Dutch and the English, the primacy of the term colored in this context, without knowing the importance of the Dutch history here. We could touch also on the Congo and the early arrival here of the Dutch, in part to take advantage of the copper export, something which is still important in the Congo today in terms of export of minerals. But I would simply note that the Dutch art of description, Olfert Dapper notably, was so precise that archaeologists have used it to find the location of Mwanza, Congo, the capital of that kingdom. And so there's a wonderful sort of cross currency here of this relationship. But let me begin with Benin and talk about culture as currency, and specifically in the context of the Kingdom of Benin in Nigeria. And simply note that enslavement was not something that was readily engaged within this context. As a matter of fact, for a long period of time, they forbade the sale of local men. What we also know is that the arrival of currency, in this case, manillas, was really important to this larger trade. Metal that was melted down and used for local art forms, jewelry, and as well as plaques. And so too were cowrie shells harvested off of the coast of India, strung together into long braided currency, and served as ballast on the ships coming from east back to west. And so we find within this larger context of Dutch engagement, and I would say other European engagement with this part of the continent, a striking cross currency of both the materials and the arts that are related to this. This is, by the way, cowrie chains in the middle, and the others are manillas. I would also note that Africa itself at this time was in many parts a very wealthy set of centers. Benin itself was exporting cloth more broadly, as were the Yoruba to the north. And early on, there was a trade in textiles from Benin to many of these other places, something that over the course of time, the Dutch, and not only the Dutch, replaced with their own manufacturers. And I'm showing you here the Rembrandt syndics of cloth makers, not because they were engaged in this particular process, but how important it was to the Dutch to create a means to produce the kind of manufacturers that would be important in these particular parts of the continent. The same was true with manillas and an array of other materials that were part of this larger process. And we can look at the arts of Benin to see how this was addressed locally. Most importantly, I think, in this sculpture of an altarpiece for Oba Owakpe, who was faced with a real crisis with many of the nobles revolting against his rule because they were in need of more manufactured goods from Europe. And in fact, it was he who decided he was going to have to change the longstanding policy and in fact begin to sell enslaved individuals so that one would be able to bring more goods from Europe into this part of the continent. So we see him here. One can talk about an array of things that are important to this particular sculpture, but among these, the two emaciated enslaved Yoruba individuals who were part of this broader trade, at least metamorphically, and think also about the hat and other elements. We know in part through the work of Dapper and other Dutch and other Europeans who arrived here that when they came to cities such as Benin City, they were overwhelmed in many respects by the complexity and the richness of this culture. The Portuguese compared it to Lisbon, the Dutch to Antwerp and Amsterdam and Haarlem, the Italians to Florence, and so on. So what changed, one could ask, and it's a really important question. 1348-49 was the Black Death, which laid low key parts of Europe and also of Africa. It took basically a century to get back into a viable production mode. Workers certainly had more power. And by that time, we had the transatlantic ocean-going voyages. But a century later, which would have been 1548, is when the Portuguese first arrived in this part of Africa. And so the Africans were met by slave raiders and armaments. And so in a certain sense, they never had a chance to recoup And then soon after followed the Industrial Revolution. And so the perception of Africa, in part through that and the slave trade, meant a complete dehumanization of the continent. How can we enslave people who are humans, who actually have a culture and religion and art and many other things that we now know that Africa had a great deal of? The Dutch, among others, were important to the export of Mediterranean coral, which itself has a history in Europe as a kind of object of, I would say, almost ritual, or at least ritual importance. The same was true in Benin, where coral is the most important part of the royal regalia. And it too, in this case, is linked to ideas of blood as in bloodlines, but also the importance of protection. We could look at salt, which was one of the key exports in the trans-Saharan trade, and the objects here of salt cellars were exported to Europe and provide an interesting glimpse into how Benin and other Africans viewed Europeans. Originally, scholars thought these to be Portuguese, but more recently, we've been speaking about these as representing Europeans more generally. A ship, a horse, weapons, tobacco pipe, these are all part of this personification. And indeed, the Europeans were viewed in a rather strange way as living dead, their white skin like corpses, strange noses, languages, hair, etc., and symbols like the ancestors of both danger and wealth. They also equated them with some strange beings locally, like the mudfish. And here in one of the most famous Benin works, the Mask of Idia, the mother of Oba Asige, the Portuguese are alternated with mudfish at the top. Mudfish is a wonderful fish that has an ability, like bears, to, in essence, hibernate over the dry season, in this case, in the dried springs, and then come back to life. It has an ability to give an electric shock, and this seeming ability to go from water to land, to be dangerous, but also to involve a kind of fleshiness that is seen to be important to the local culture and what it provides. Imports, brass, coral, cloth, elite goods, and guns were used here primarily for expansion of the Benin Kingdom into the area at large. And one can see in some of these works, which probably owe something to imported objects of prestige, the equation of the Europeans with guns to carrion birds, most notably the marabou stork. Perhaps also in the Benin plaques, we can see something of complements with what was happening in Europe with wall paintings and books. Historically, there were the equivalent of wall murals of various forms, some sculpted, but the focus on history and revealing the sort of details of the court seems to be new in this context. And indeed, they're also shown in frames made out of brass, which is imported from Europe, although there was local copper. And look at the incised leaf decorations as well, and we begin to think of possible complementary elements. As we move to Dahomey, next door where factories were set up, these would be centers for trade where factors existed. The Dutch, the French, the English, and the Portuguese competed with one another for the attention of the king, primarily through goods. And he had direct control over them, and he made it manifest in a wide variety of rituals that they were required to attend. And through these rites, we can also see how they're appropriating European goods and ideas. Flags here at the palace in Abomey mean not European control of the palace, but of the palace control of Europeans and their goods. The same thing is true of this enormous ship, which was created for the palace a fair distance from the coast. The king most closely associated with the taking of Ouidah, the principal port on the Atlantic, was King Agaja. In this particular period, his emblem is a ship, perhaps modeled in part on a silver nef, which were made not only by the Dutch, but by others as well. And we can see also, as we're looking at some of these important early engravings of the key aspects that were important in terms of trade goods, Bear in mind that the Dahomey were not like the Benin kings. They preyed on locals, and it was really vile, going up, particularly at harvest time, burning the fields, taking men, women, and children into their clutches for purposes of gaining more European goods, whether it was tobacco or tobacco pipes or cowrie shells, which was the currency, or chairs or jewelry or other items. It all played an important role. Here we have King Behaza, the last of the Dahomey kings, who was forced into exile from the French, completely addicted to tobacco. And we can see her also that it was not just the addiction aspect and the profits that were part of this, but also the fact that humans were equated with Dutch pipes in terms of the sale of individuals. And we can date many of the archaeological sites in West Africa by a combination of corn, which is arriving from the Americas, and the remains of Dutch pipes, some of which were, of course, re-engaged through local forms of representation. And it was fashion and costume that was critical as well, and not just a Rembrandt, whose ostrich feather comes from Africa as part of this reverse trade. But the reason Aga wanted to take the coast was to take control of these goods, particularly of textiles. And it really is only in the 20th century, after independence, that a return to a kind of sense of a local, distinctively African kind of royal dress comes into vogue. It was not at this point. Europeans made a fortune, the Dutch and others, on things such as hats and cloth, and again, trading of individuals for tobacco and for things such as flannel. Gold, of course, was at the center of this, beginning in the late 14th century, or early 14th century rather, when the European turned to gold and to the gold standard. And while we think about gold weights within the context of Dutch painting, it's also important and speaks specifically to what is happening in Ghana, our third site, where, of course, it was known as the gold trade. And here, too, like Benin, for the most part, they had enough to export, particularly in gold, so that enslaved individuals were not part of this. But what gold was exchanged for was guns, among other things, in part to, again, advance and to protect their own interests. So as we're thinking about exhibiting key works of Dutch paintings that involve gold or vessels or other things, I hope that we'll also consider the ways in which some of these same forms are found in important works of African art. The currency weighing system changes as in Ghana when they go from the Islamic system to the European, and there are an array of different kinds of engagements that would be really interesting to bring into these exhibits among these vessels. And this too goes back early with the finding of a once handsome Mamluk vessel on the shrines to the gold gods, the river gods that furnish the gold. Here it's important to note this gold is not part of an individual's means of showing his prestige just for the sake of that. But all gold could only be shown in the context of displays and expenses that were to benefit the broader community. And like the Dutch, in Ghana, vessels were critically important to religious rituals, to their gods, and as part of the ways in which they were shaping their identity with the broader world. Perhaps most famous is the Richard II ewer from the late 14th century, the finest extant one. But it's also interesting to think about some of these vessels, and particularly punch, and a punch bowl in terms of the dating of this. And I cite here a 1764 punch bowl now in the British Museum, and would note the labor with which it has been repaired and how important its patina is. Punch, of course, is necessitated in a way by the Dutch trade and others from the east to the west, alcohol, citrus, spices, etc. Punch bowls are critical to the revolution, the American Revolution, which also in part took place on the Fonte coastline, where they had put up a blockade preventing the interior gold from reaching Europe. And in part as a result of it, the Dutch and the English sent a huge array of vessels to this part of Africa to try to convince the rulers here to maintain the trade with England and Holland. And in turn, in Ghana, they would create these sword ornaments in the forms of some of these vessels, most notably here, probably a covered punch bowl with these kind of handles that suggest that the Richard II ewer had recently arrived. But they're also making miniatures, really grasping the details of these works that are part of these swords, not to continue war, but swords to swear allegiance on and to bring the community together. You're probably all familiar with this wonderful marble sculpture that Esther Schroeder has spoken about, with the coiffure linked in part to the fort on the coast. Like Claudia, I would simply emphasize in part the ebony and the turtle at the foot. But note too the silk, which was brought here from Asia and then unraveled to make the famous kente. And the importance of these contracts with Accra, in part to enforce the selling of enslaved individuals. So it was in part a two-way street and a very painful one. And we can't really end this without looking at the famed Dutch wax cloth, which started in the 19th century following on earlier traditions of manufacturing textiles here, and continues to this day with the famous Blisco textiles sold in West Africa, and in a certain sense competing and replacing various kinds of local textile manufacturing. So let me conclude by just saying that as we're thinking about repatriation of objects, and Benin, Dahomey, and Asante are all in this, I would simply quote Barbara Plankensteiner, who's been a real leader in this, to say, these are not just looted goods, they're highlights of global art. And through them, I think we have a much better understanding, not only with what was happening in Africa, but also the place of Africa and its arts within the broader economy of a global art history community. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you to all of our speakers. We're now going to open up for question and answer, so all of our speakers can come back and unmute themselves. All of your presentations were so wonderful. And what I find most interesting is the through line that you're not all thinking merely about representing Blackness, but how we witness it. And so my first question, I feel like could go to Vincent and sort of Claudia, and thinking about this image economy of terror and the way that that sort of has a very long history from slavery even to now that we think about contemporary instances of police killing. And so I'm wondering how you all are thinking about witnessing with those images, but also how it trickles into, for the other historians, into images that we see in museums. And so the various different ways that we witness Blackness in these times.
Well, just briefly, and maybe less specifically than Professor Swan. I mean, I see these images that you're kind of, I think, rightfully identifying as part of an economy, a visual economy of terror, as indicating a process and a relatively continuous process, as I said, of exploitation, of subjugation, of militarism that, you know, really built the colonial empires in the Americas and beyond. And that has not ended, did not end with the formal end of slavery. It did not end with the formal end of empire. Something that's largely continuous, and something that I think that we have to wrestle with urgently, right? I tend to think that, you know, poverty, racism, and militarism, as Martin Luther King identified them, are the triple evils that are really threatening our civilization. And if we don't contend with those, if we don't figure out how it is we're going to use these images as indications of a process that we have to confront, I think we're in deep trouble.
And I would just add that there was a slide that I didn't show that was also of the Asia and Amsterdam exhibition from 2015, 2016, which was of a Coromandel Coast ebony chest. And it was displayed directly under the portrait of Jan Pietersen Koen, who is the most renowned for his violence, Governor General of the Dutch East India Company, although the competition is stiff. But and there was no way within that exhibition of situating these objects vis-a-vis the persons. And what I wanted to do here was to say that the effort to identify individuals is critical, but if it happens at the expense of considering the history of those individuals who will be forever lost to the record, who cannot be recuperated from the record because they were enslaved, that sort of to call attention to that problem and to say that I do think that there are stories, historical stories that we can tell about the taste, about the objects, about the people involved, that can help to witness indeed this past, at least the past. The question of how to bring that into the present is of course a charged one, but that's the job of the museologists. Yeah.
And then we have some questions from the question and answer box. So to Elmer, it is remarkable how many representations of Black servants survive. What you've shown today, I'm sure, reflects just a small portion of what you've uncovered, and yet they were overlooked for so long. Were these paintings generally on view over the years, or were they not shown? How do you explain their belated entry into scholarship on Dutch art? And could you say a word about how slavery was officially illegal within the Netherlands and the extent to which the 17th century Dutch population at large and the Dutch artists would have been aware of the slave trade and made this connection between the pictorial tradition and the realities of slavery in the period?
I think those were 3 questions.
There were. So essentially the history of the paintings and their exhibitions. How do you think they're being sort of integrated into Dutch art in terms that are technically belated? And then also,
shall I start with that first, maybe? The strange thing is that these paintings have, well, many of these paintings have, let's say, always been on show. As long as we have museums, they have been visible for a larger audience. And some of these paintings were in, for example, the Amsterdam Town Hall, where many people could see it. The Amsterdam Town Hall was a public place. Not all the offices were accessible for everyone, but largely it was a public place. So in any case, in, let's say, the 20th century, most of the paintings that I showed would be accessible and visible. The thing is not that the objects were not there, but the interest was not there. I think that is crucial. And I expect, or I suspect, that the arrival of people from the former colonies slowly started to change society, and in that process, our eyes were opened for or to these other people and objects, because we're also talking about ebony, porcelain, all of this, to these people and these objects in these paintings. So I think it's not so much that the paintings were not visible, but it's the interest that was not there for a very, very long time. I think it only began maybe slowly in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s it caught on. And of course it takes a while before exhibitions are made and it's sort of put on a more public platform. So that would be the first question. I thought Pepijn was also nodding, and maybe he wanted to address it as well. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah, well, yes, because you can. This is true for the paintings, of course, but it's also true for the wider sort of landscape of the city. And sort of, if you walk through Amsterdam, it's so visibly a colonial city, right? There's so much reference to empire. There's individuals in the stone set above sort of the doors of the houses. There's characters, presentations of black people. There is Surinamese coffee. There is wherever you go in the city, and still people can see Amsterdam as a city where, well, hardly anyone sees Amsterdam as an example of a city that sort of where the architecture speaks of colonial power, right? So it's certainly not about the sort of the non-presence, but and it is about learning how to see, I guess. So I completely agree with Elmer, but this doesn't stop at the walls of the museum. It's everywhere around us.
No.
I just wanted to comment also that, you know, Elmer showed one example that is very famous to, well known to people who've thought about Dutch art and Black lives, and that is the Bartholomeus van der Helst portrait of the militia company that hangs next to the Night Watch, in which the figure of the Black boy has been fundamentally, let's say, functionally invisible. And I think one of the questions that, and I think as both of you have pointed out, these images are everywhere. They're there. That's not a problem of somebody suddenly, you know, pulling the curtain back. I think the real question is, what is at stake in not acknowledging the origins of those images? I mean, what is the problem with not acknowledging what those images are doing? And I think when you start to ask that question, you run up against having to confront the fact that those images as pictorial strategies and everything they represent support white supremacy. I mean, there's really no getting around that. And so, but I think there must be a way to, you know, and this is what's terrific about the publication. I'm sorry about the danger involved, Elmer, but the publication in the Volkskrant of your pictorial research into the origins of the Zwarte Piet is that it starts to unpack this as a pictorial strategy where that is fed by power relations, actual power relations. And I think until, you know, we just start to say, look, to ignore these images is to support that structure. And I mean, this is of course happening, but I just, it seems sad that it isn't a more immediate, these are not more immediately available points of contact, points of association, for example, to what Suzanne has presented. Yeah, so sorry.
Oh, thank you for that. And then also, we have a question for Suzanne. I found the incorporation of Europeans in Benin art and specifically the idiom mask very interesting. Can you speak more about the significance of symbolism and how it integrates with native themes?
Yeah, a great question, and one that has long fascinated me. I think as we think about Europeans, they always assume that they're going to arrive and be viewed as the norm. And yet throughout West Africa, they're viewed as historically very strange. And I find that in how they are being engaged in this context, particularly, it's not so much as the individual with the greasy, stringy hair and the emaciated long faces, which in a certain sense would be quite natural with sailors who'd been aboard a ship a long time. But also the way that they are equating them in the Benin context with some very strange natural beings, whether it's the marabou stork, which sits on rooftops awaiting prey that have been killed through offerings or other means, or whether it's through this fascination with the mudfish as a being that can leave and come back to life. And in a certain sense, I also am thinking that these are some of the things that the Europeans themselves are conveying. As you think about the cross currency of this with some of the ideas about Christianity, Jesus coming back to life, etc. I mean, they're a wonderful set of quite hard to digest tropes within the context of Christianity that are quite interesting in this regard. But I've written an article about it a while back, and so I don't want to spend much more time talking about it here, but it's really important to look both ways, is what I'm suggesting. And so I'm glad that you brought that up.
And then we have time for one more question, but I'm positing to everyone generally. It's kind of broad, but what are you all sort of thinking of your work contributing to your own visions and world-making projects, as I kind of opened with earlier? Some of you are working with objects, some with more painting works. You're doing very different things with different histories of slavery. And so how are you thinking about a world that can address all these things?
Let me just jump in, and I will say I've been on a mission for a long time, more decades than I care to admit, to try to integrate African art within the context of the global museum more generally as a key part of a global art history. And it's not just the museum, but also in my work on the medieval period in looking at how Africa really shaped the European world in an array of ways, to try to get outside this idea that it had nothing. And in fact, it did. And I think we can see that in many different ways. And for me, art stands at the core of a visual primacy that provides us evidence of this, where written traditions may not.
If I may respond to that, for me, art is dangerously deceptive. You can, you can use it for almost anything you'd like, and that, for me, makes it very, very important to understand the context in which it was created at one point, but also the context in which it was perceived in other times in history, and to understand that sort of process, the development, the movement. And so it's a way to try to understand how people saw the world and why they needed art to shape it, to give shape to their vision. And that is something that applies to Middle Ages or 17th century or whatever, but also to our own time. And it becomes interesting and complicated when views start clashing while the objects actually remain the same. They haven't changed. And that means, for me, contextualizing is very, very important. Maybe that sometimes means trying to understand also what you do not, let me put that very, very quietly, what you do not appreciate. I mean, there are much stronger words for this, but trying to understand that that side as well. So for me, that's important, and that's difficult. But maybe that's why I personally think this type of research is very relevant. Does it make any sense? I hope it does.
Can I come in as well? My individual work is on slavery and capitalism. So the objects that I work with usually are these most commodified remnants of the history of slavery. So I work with account books where people are literally being sort of boiled down into numbers. So in a way, sort of engaging in the debates about visualization or looking at ideologies of enslavement is looking at different stages in this process of dehumanization. And I think the only reason to do that is to sort of to try to sort of find the way back from that, right? To sort of to show how this sort of this is actually a human history, and that to me seems relevant because the although slavery is not with us, sort of capitalism as a system that dehumanizes and commodifies is with us. So it tells us fundamental things about the history, but it also tells us fundamental things about the present, in my view.
I also want to just say, I mean, I'm so grateful to all of the speakers and for all of what they've presented. And you know, one of the things about, and last week as well, one of the sort of structuring paradoxes of these sessions is that, you know, slavery in the museum, I mean, slavery is, as Professor Brown showed, slavery as such, or implied, or at least this is what I took away, is not depicted. I mean, that's not the subject of the art in museums, at least, for sure. And where it does, you know, break into the pictorial realm, it's where it's a fear of its power that we see depicted. At least I hope I'm not misinterpreting. And so this really is a really profound dynamic, is to say, well, you know, we're working on materials that by their very nature, you know, as products of, yes, of the newly, you know, capitalistic world of the early modern era, in Holland in particular, are not going to depict the forces that make them, that enable them. And so, you know, I mean, that's always the problem for an art historian, of course, is you know, what's not in the picture. And I think this is a really crucial moment. At the same time that, as somebody said to me when I was talking about the ebony chest, isn't it that this kind of taste for these, I mean, really massive, black, oily, shiny, valuable objects. I mean, it's just horrifying, but didn't that enable the objectification of the persons? You know, isn't there a way in which the taste actually has that there is a politics of that, in that sense? Like, what does that enable if what you are appreciating about what is coming out of the world of that labor, you know, how does it feed back? So anyway, this is just to say that I don't think that we should be disappointed that the actual process of slavery is not depicted. I think that's sort of the point. It's to look for, and that's what I find so inspiring about all of these presentations last week and this week, is that it's to look for how we can get at that force, pictorial strategies that allow us to then talk about the history, let's say, allow us to talk and to think about the reduplicative effect of displaying these objects without further explanation of their histories.
Yeah, I mean, following up on that briefly, and also on some things that Pepijn was saying, you know, the role of a commodity is to obscure the social relations that made it, as Marx famously taught us. And, you know, one can see these images in that way as commodities. And then we have to, as Elmer said, contextualize them to go back and see those social relations. As I was saying earlier, to see the process out of which these artifacts came, right? And that will tell us, and I've been following Suzanne Blier's career, my entire career, about those larger common histories that we all share, right? So that we can integrate these histories that are almost always seen as somehow, you know, categorically distinct, which denies the process, which denies the interconnection. So, you know, going back to your question about how this shapes my own art practice, I've been doing more work in storytelling in the televisual media. And, you know, what I always try to do is choose and use and represent pictures that can tell me those larger stories of interconnection and context that can help us see how we share a common history and hopefully a common future as well.
Thank you. That was our last question. It's been such a pleasure and a joy to moderate this conversation with you all. And I know that we all wish we could continue. Thank you to all of our audience members for joining us and participating in what I hope you found to be a very enriching dialogue. A warm thank you once again to all our speakers, my co-hosts as well, and all the individuals behind the scenes that you all don't see that make everything possible. We hope that you will return for our remaining 2 sessions of the 4-part program. Both occur on April 23rd. For more information and to register, please click the links in the chat. Thank you and have a great day.